emperors don't just demand soldiers. They crave dedication, secrecy, and sometimes the ultimate sacrifice from those perceived to have the fewest earthly ties. Ever wondered which critical wartime jobs were almost exclusively filled by people without a spouse waiting anxiously at home? From ancient priestesses whose sacred duties were believed to safeguard a city's fate during brutal sieges, to young pilots in the 1940s embarking on deliberate one-way missions with no expectation of return, history reveals that single status was. This wasn't always about choice, but about regulations, societal beliefs, or the sheer grim practicalities of conflict. Get ready to uncover 8 wartime roles, where being unmarried was a fundamental and often unyielding part of the job description. Nursing nuns, the unseen angels of mercy on history's battlefields. Long before organized military nursing corps became commonplace, a unique group of women consistently appeared on battlefields and in makeshift hospitals, driven by faith and a vow of celibacy, nursing nuns. These women, members of various religious orders, were by definition unmarried. Their commitment to a life of service free from marital or familial obligations as understood by society made them uniquely available and dedicated to the harrowing task of caring for the sick and wounded during wartime. Their presence was notable in numerous conflicts. During the Crimean War, fought between 1853 and 1856, Irish Sisters of Mercy, led by Mother Mary Frances Bridgman, traveled to the war zone. They arrived in Constantinople and later Scutari around the same time as Florence Nightingale, and worked tirelessly, often in appalling conditions, to tend to soldiers suffering from battle wounds and diseases like cholera and typhus. Records show at least 118 nuns from France, Ireland, and England served. Their prior experience in nursing the poor in their communities meant they brought valuable skills, and their disciplined, selfless approach earned them respect. These sisters faced the same dangers as other medical personnel: disease, exhaustion, and the psychological toll of constant suffering. The American Civil War, from 1861 to 1865, saw an even larger deployment of nursing nuns. Over 600 sisters from at least 12 different Catholic religious orders, such as the Sisters of Charity, the Sisters of Mercy, and the Daughters of the Cross, volunteered their services to both Union and Confederate armies. They worked on hospital ships, in field hospitals, often perilously close to the fighting, and in established military hospitals far from the front lines. For example, the Sisters of Charity of Emmitsburg, Maryland, sent members to staff military hospitals across the country. Sister Anthony O'Connell, known as the Angel of the Battlefield, earned fame for her work at places like Shiloh, where she treated wounded from both sides with impartiality. Being unmarried and part of a structured religious order allowed them to be mobilized and deployed with a degree. Their distinctive habits became a familiar sight, often inspiring a sense of comfort and reverence among soldiers of all faiths. They were not paid by the military in the same way as contract nurses. Their work was an extension of their religious vocation. The fact they sought no payment beyond basic subsistence sometimes eased their acceptance in chaotic administrative environments. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871, thousands of nuns from French and German religious orders were involved in nursing duties. They converted convents into hospitals and went to the front lines. Their unmarried status meant they had no husbands to object to their dangerous work, nor young children reliant on their daily care at home, which was a significant societal consideration at the time for women undertaking such roles. This perceived freedom from domestic responsibilities, combined with their vows, made them an invaluable and readily available nursing workforce. Even into World War I, while professional nursing was becoming more militarized and secularized, nuns continued to serve. Belgian nuns, for instance, were noted for their bravery in caring for wounded soldiers, sometimes under direct enemy fire, after the German invasion in 1914. Their convents often became sanctuaries and impromptu hospitals. The exclusivity of this role to unmarried individuals is inherent in the nature of Catholic sisterhood, which requires vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vow of chastity means they are, and remain, unmarried. This religious commitment, rather than a military regulation, defined their single status. Their contribution, often overlooked in broader military histories, was substantial. They provided not only skilled nursing care but also spiritual comfort, and their presence helped to humanize the brutal landscape of war. They navigated complex situations, often dealing with anti-Catholic prejudice, yet their dedication frequently won over skeptics. Their work also had a subtle but important influence on the development of professional nursing, demonstrating the capabilities of women in medical care long before it was widely accepted. Number 7. The first Wrens of World War I, bound by rules of singlehood for king and country. When Britain faced the escalating pressures of the First World War, the demand for manpower on the front lines created an urgent need for women to fill roles at home and within the support structures of the armed forces. In 1917, the Women's Royal Naval Service, popularly known as the Wrens, was formed, marking a significant step for women in military service. For many of the initial roles, particularly those involving direct enlistment and specific responsibilities, being unmarried was a key criterion, or at least a very strong preference. Context was a society where married women, especially those with children, were largely expected to focus on domestic duties. The Admiralty, in establishing the Wrens, aimed to release men for sea duty by employing women in a wide array of shore-based jobs. These included clerks, cooks, telegraphists, wireless operators, code breakers, drivers, mechanics, and storekeepers. The initial recruitment drive often stipulated conditions related to marital status. For certain categories of enlistment, particularly for mobile Wrens, who could be posted anywhere, candidates were preferred if they were unmarried or widowed without young dependent children. The official age for enrollment was 18 to 45, extendable to 50 for certain specialist roles. The reasoning behind this preference for unmarried women was multifaceted. Firstly, mobility was crucial. Unmarried women were seen as more easily deployable to various naval bases around the country or even overseas, in some instances without the perceived complications of uprooting a family or leaving a husband behind. Secondly, there were societal norms. The idea of a married woman, especially a mother, leaving her home for military service was still quite radical for many. Thirdly, there may have been administrative or financial considerations, such as pensions or dependency allowances, which were simpler for single individuals. For example, women recruited as telegraphists or for confidential coding and cipher duties, roles that demanded intense concentration and secrecy, were often young and single. They handled sensitive naval communications, a task vital to the war effort. Living in communal Wren accommodations or designated hostels, they adhered to strict naval discipline. The number of Wrens grew rapidly, reaching over 5,500 members by the end of 1918, with an additional 500 officers. Approximately 2,000 Wrens served with the Royal Naval Air Service. Dame Catherine was the first director of the Wrens. She was a widow, her husband having died some years before the war, which perhaps aligned with the implicit understanding that women with fewer immediate family ties were considered suitable for such demanding leadership roles in a new and evolving service. The Wrens were not strictly speaking combatants, and they did not receive the same pay or benefits as their male counterparts. A Dumman shorthand typist, for instance, might earn around 46 shillings a week, while a male equivalent doing similar work could earn more. While the exclusively unmarried rule was not absolute across every single position or for the entire duration of the service. Some widowed women were accepted, and rules could be flexible based on need. There was a clear and documented preference, and often a requirement for many enlistees, especially in the initial phases and for particular duties. The Women's Royal Naval Service was disbanded in 1919 after the war, but was reformed in 1939 on the eve of the Second World War, where similar considerations about marital status, though perhaps less rigid over time, and initially played a part in recruitment strategies before the sheer scale of that conflict necessitated broader enlistment. The legacy of these first Wrens was significant, proving the capability of women in uniformed service and paving the way for future generations. Their largely unmarried status was a characteristic shaped by the societal and military pragmatism of their era. Number 6. Special Operations Executives Female Agents, where single status was a grim asset in perilous missions. The Special Operations Executive, a clandestine British organization formed in 1940 during the Second World War, was tasked with conducting espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe. It famously set Europe ablaze, and a crucial though small part of its operative force consisted of women. While not an absolute explicit rule that all female agents had to be unmarried, the nature of the work extraordinarily dangerous, requiring deep cover, total commitment, and a high likelihood of capture, torture, or death, meant that unmarried women, or women whose marital circumstances allowed for such risks, like widows or those separated from spouses by war, were often considered highly suitable candidates. Recruiters for the Special Operations Executive, like the notable Vera Atkins, who was second in command of F Section France, looked for individuals with specific qualities, fluency in languages like French, courage, independence, resourcefulness, and the ability to blend in. Being unmarried could be seen as an advantage, or rather, the absence of immediate family ties like a husband and young children at home could be perceived by recruiters as simplifying the incredibly risky deployment. An agent operating undercover for months or even years, completely cut off from their previous life, faced immense psychological pressure. The thought was that fewer close dependents might mean less personal anguish or distraction for the agent, and perhaps cruelly, less complicated repercussions for the organization if the agent was lost. Consider the profiles of some of the most famous female Special Operations Executive agents. Violette Chabot, for instance, was a widow when she undertook her most dangerous missions. Her husband, a French army officer, had been killed in action. This left her with a young daughter, but her status as a widow perhaps aligned with the profile of someone deeply committed to the fight and with fewer immediate claims on her presence at home than a married woman whose husband was not in active service. Noor Inayat Khan, a wireless operator who was posthumously awarded the George Cross, was unmarried. Odette Hallows, another George Cross recipient, was married and had 3 daughters, but her husband was in the army, and she made agonizing choices about her children's care to undertake her mission. Her case shows it wasn't exclusively unmarried women, but her situation was one of existing separation due to war. The numbers highlight the danger of the 55 women officially sent by the Special Operations Executive into occupied territory. 39 were F Section agents sent to France. Of these 39, 13 did not return. Training was rigorous, covering everything from parachute jumping and silent killing to Morse code and resisting interrogation. Agents knew the risks were immense. For a woman to be inserted into enemy territory, often alone or with a small team, required a particular kind of dedication that might be perceived as more readily found in individuals without the immediate responsibilities of a spouse, and a settled home life that could be jeopardized or cause divided loyalties. The argument for exclusivity here is less about a formal written policy and more about the pragmatic, if harsh, realities of recruiting for what were essentially suicide missions for many. The organization needed individuals who could disappear into a new identity endure isolation, and face extreme peril. While bravery and skill were paramount, the personal circumstances of a candidate, including marital status, undoubtedly factored into the assessment of their suitability and deployability for these unique and hazardous wartime roles. The fewer anchors one had to a normal life, the more plausible it might seem that one could fully commit to the shadowy, perilous existence of an undercover operative. These women performed acts of incredible bravery, and their personal situations, often involving a lack of conventional marital ties, were part of the complex equation that led them to this extraordinary service. Number 5. The Hinuri students, Okinawan schoolgirls thrown into war's horrors as unmarried nurses. The Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 was one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. Amidst the carnage, a particularly tragic story unfolded, involving a group of high school girls and their teachers, collectively known as the Hinuri Gakutai, or Lily Corps. These students, by virtue of their age and status as schoolgirls, were all unmarried when they were mobilized by the Imperial Japanese Army to serve as assistant nurses. Their experience represents a devastating instance where youth and unmarried status directly led to involvement in a brutal wartime role. In March 1945, as the American invasion of Okinawa loomed, 222 female students, aged between 15 and 19 from the Okinawa Daiichi Women's High School and Okinawa Shihan Women's School, along with 18 of their teachers, were conscripted. They were not professional nurses. They were ordinary schoolgirls, thrust into the chaos of war with minimal medical training, often just a few weeks' worth. Their unmarried status was simply a consequence of their youth. In Japanese society at the time, girls of this age would almost universally be unmarried, and still under the authority of their families or schools. The Hinuri students were assigned to the Heizagwa Okinawa Army Field Hospital, a network of dark, damp caves that served as a makeshift medical facility for wounded Japanese soldiers. Their duties were harrowing. They fetched water and food under fire, disposed of amputated limbs and human waste, assisted with crude surgeries, often performed without anesthesia, and tried to comfort dying soldiers. Conditions were horrific, overcrowded, unsanitary, with constant shelling and the stench of death and disease. The girls worked tirelessly, witnessing unimaginable suffering and facing constant danger. As the American forces advanced and the Japanese lines collapsed, the situation for the Hinuri students became even more desperate. On May 25, 1945, the order came to dissolve the main hospital unit, and the girls were largely left to fend for themselves in the ensuing chaos, though some groups remained with retreating army units. Many were killed by shelling, caught in crossfire, or encouraged or forced to commit suicide rather than be captured. Some died from disease or starvation. The statistics are stark. Of the 240 individuals in the Hinuri unit, 222 students and 18 teachers, 136 perished during the Battle of Okinawa, or in its immediate aftermath. This represents a casualty rate of over 56%. Their youth and unmarried status did not protect them. Rather, their availability as a mobilized group of students made them vulnerable to such exploitation by the military. They were seen as a resource. The story of the Hinuri students has become a powerful symbol in Okinawa of the horrors of war and the sacrifice of innocent lives. The Hinuri Peace Museum, located on Okinawa, stands as a memorial to them, preserving their stories and photographs, ensuring their experience is not forgotten. Their role was exclusively filled by unmarried individuals because it was exclusively filled by young schoolgirls, a demographic that by its very nature in that time and place was single. Their involvement was not a choice in any meaningful sense, but a directive in a society mobilized for total war, where even children were drawn into the maelstrom. Their fate was the brutal reality that in extreme conflicts, societal norms around protection of the young can be tragically overridden by military desperation. Number 4. Kamikaze pilots. Young men on one-way missions, their futures forfeited. In the final desperate stages of the Second World War in the Pacific, Japan resorted to a terrifying new tactic: suicide attacks by pilots known as kamikaze, meaning divine wind. These pilots, officially part of the Tokubetsu Kogakitai, or Special Attack Units, deliberately crashed their explosive-laden aircraft into Allied warships. The vast majority of these young men were unmarried, a characteristic stemming from their youth, the cultural context of extreme sacrifice, and the very nature of their fatal mission. Kamikaze strategy was formally adopted in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, as Japan faced overwhelming Allied military superiority. The typical kamikaze pilot was very young, often in his late teens or early 20s. Many were university students rushed through flight training or newly commissioned junior officers. At this age, in 1940s, Japan, most young men would not yet be married. Marriage was a significant step, often arranged and typically undertaken a bit later in life after establishing a career or completing studies. The ideology underpinning the kamikaze phenomenon was complex, rooted in a distorted interpretation of Bushido, the samurai code, extreme nationalism, emperor worship, and a sense of duty to sacrifice oneself for the nation in a crisis. Pilots were indoctrinated to believe that their death would be a glorious act, contributing to the defense of their homeland and the emperor. The letters and diaries left behind by some kamikaze pilots reveal a range of emotions: fear, determination, sadness, patriotic fervor, but also a common understanding that they were forfeiting their entire future, including the prospect of marriage and family. Because the missions were intentionally suicidal, there was no expectation of return. This reality meant that sending unmarried young men was, from a grimly pragmatic military and societal perspective, perhaps seen as a lesser loss in terms of ongoing family responsibilities compared to sending married men with wives and children. While this was unlikely an explicit policy, the demographic pool of available pilots skewed heavily towards the young and unmarried. Approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots are estimated to have died in kamikaze attacks during the war. Some sources suggest numbers closer to 4,000 from the Imperial Japanese Navy alone, with the Army contributing more. They flew various aircraft, from standard fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0 modified to carry bombs, to specially designed suicide craft like the Yokosuka Maxi-7 Oka, a rocket-powered human-guided bomb. The pilots often participated in farewell rituals, writing last letters, and receiving a ceremonial sip of sake. They wore hekimaki headbands, often inscribed with patriotic slogans. Their targets were primarily Allied naval vessels, and they did inflict significant damage and casualties, sinking or damaging hundreds of ships. For instance, during the Battle of Okinawa alone, kamikaze attacks were relentless and caused substantial losses to the United States fleet. The exclusivity of this role to unmarried individuals was not a written rule, but a de facto reality. Intense pressure, the short time frame of the program's existence in the war's final year, and the age of the recruits meant that the overwhelming majority were single. They were portrayed in Japanese propaganda as pure, selfless heroes, embodying the ultimate sacrifice. Their youth and unmarried status contributed to this image of untainted devotion, unencumbered by worldly ties, offering their pure lives for the nation. Their story is a stark reminder of how wartime pressures and extreme ideologies can lead to the systematic sacrifice of a generation's young, unmarried members. Number 3. The United States Army Nurse Corps, where early rules mandated singlehood for service. The formal establishment of the United States Army Nurse Corps in 1901 marked a pivotal moment, professionalizing nursing within the military and providing a dedicated pathway for women to serve. However, for a significant period, this service came with a stringent condition related to marital status. Nurses were required to be unmarried. If they chose to marry, they were often compelled to resign their commission. This policy made certain eras of Army nursing almost exclusively the domain of single women. The Army Reorganization Act of February 2, 1901, officially created the Nurse Corps female as a permanent part of the Army Medical Department. The initial requirements for appointment were strict. Applicants had to be female between the ages of 25 and 35, though this varied slightly over time. Graduates of recognized nursing schools, and crucially unmarried. This stipulation remained largely in effect for decades through the First World War and into the period leading up to the Second World War. The rationale behind this policy was rooted in several contemporary beliefs and practical considerations. Firstly, there was the societal view that a married woman's primary responsibility was to her husband and home. Military service, with its demands for mobility, long hours, and deployment to potentially dangerous locations, was seen as incompatible with these domestic duties. Secondly, the military valued unwavering dedication and availability. Unmarried nurses were perceived as having fewer external commitments and thus able to devote themselves entirely to their duties and be deployed more readily. There might also have been administrative concerns regarding spousal benefits or housing for married personnel that the military was not prepared to address for female nurses at that time. During the First World War, the need for nurses surged. Over 21,000 American nurses served in the Army Nurse Corps, with more than 10,000 deployed overseas to base hospitals, casualty clearing stations, and hospital trains in places like France and Britain. These women, adhering to the existing regulations, were overwhelmingly single or widowed, without dependents. They faced immense challenges dealing with horrific new types of injuries, from machine guns, artillery, and poison gas, as well as devastating outbreaks of diseases like the 1918 influenzas alongside their patients. For their service, Army nurses held relative rank, meaning they had the status of officers for authority and respect, but not the full pay, privileges, or retirement benefits of male officers. It was not until 1920 that they were granted actual officer rank, albeit still without full commensurate pay. The marriage restriction continued through the interwar years. If a nurse in the Corps decided to marry, she was generally expected to submit her resignation. This created a situation where experienced nurses were lost to the service if they chose to start a family. As the Second World War approached and then engulfed the nation, the demand for nurses skyrocketed once again. While the preference for unmarried nurses remained strong, the sheer scale of the need began to force some adjustments. During the Second World War, over 59,000 women served in the United States Army Nurse Corps. While official policy changes regarding marriage were slow, practical exceptions, and waivers sometimes occurred due to manpower shortages, particularly later in the war. However, the underlying expectation often persisted. It was only in the post-Second World War era, with changing societal norms and a greater recognition of women's roles, that these marriage restrictions were formally and completely lifted, allowing married women to serve freely and continue their careers in the Army Nurse Corps without penalty. For many foundational years of its existence, however, service as an Army nurse was a path predominantly, and often exclusively, open to unmarried women. Number 2. Catholic military chaplains, bound by a vow of celibacy in service to God and soldiers. Throughout centuries of warfare, spiritual support for soldiers has been a recognized need, leading to the role of the military chaplain. Among these, Catholic priests, serving as chaplains, represent a distinct group whose participation is exclusively predicated on their unmarried status. Due to the discipline of celibacy in the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church. This requirement, fundamental to their priesthood, means that every Catholic priest chaplain ministering to armed forces is by definition unmarried. The history of Catholic chaplains in military service is long and extensive, stretching back to ancient times in various forms, but becoming more formalized with standing armies. The requirement for priestly celibacy in the Western Church was solidified over centuries, notably reinforced by councils such as the First Lateran Council in 1123 and later the Council of Trent, 1545–1563. This discipline means that candidates for ordination as priests in the Latin Rite commit to a life of celibacy, dedicating themselves entirely to God and the Church without the responsibilities and commitments of marriage and family. In wartime, the role of the Catholic chaplain is multifaceted and vital. They provide sacraments such as Mass, confession, anointing of the sick, last rites, and baptism. They offer spiritual guidance, counseling, and moral support to soldiers facing fear, loss, and the ethical dilemmas of combat. Their presence is often a source of comfort and strength, not just to Catholic personnel, but sometimes to those of other faiths or no faith at all. Chaplains share the hardships and dangers of the troops they serve, often deployed to frontline units, field hospitals, and ships at sea. During major conflicts, like the First World War and the Second World War, thousands of Catholic priests served as chaplains with the armed forces of various nations. For example, in the United States military during the Second World War, it is estimated that over 2,800 Catholic priests served as chaplains across all branches. They endured the same conditions as the soldiers, facing enemy fire, bombardment, and the risk of capture. Many were decorated for bravery, and some, like Father Joseph O'Callaghan, a Navy chaplain awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions aboard the US Franklin during an attack in 1945, became legendary figures. Another notable example is Father Emil Capon, a United States Army chaplain who died in a North Korean prisoner of war camp during the Korean War and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor and later declared a servant of God by the Catholic Church. The first step towards sainthood. The unmarried status of these chaplains is not merely incidental. It is intrinsically linked to their priestly vocation. The Church teaches that celibacy allows a priest to dedicate himself more fully to his ministry with an undivided heart, likening his commitment to a spiritual marriage to the Church. In the demanding and often perilous context of military chaplaincy, this freedom from familial obligations is seen as enabling them to be more available and mobile, ready to go wherever they are needed, often at short notice and into dangerous situations, without the direct concerns of leaving a wife and children. Their training typically involves not only theological and pastoral education, but also military indoctrination and courses on how to function within the armed forces structure. They hold officer rank, which facilitates their movement and access to personnel at all levels. The sight of a chaplain, often identifiable by religious insignia on their uniform, administering rites on a battlefield or offering a quiet word in a moment of crisis, has been a powerful and enduring image in the annals of warfare. Their contribution, made possible by their unique unmarried commitment, has been a constant feature of military life for centuries, providing spiritual solace amidst the temporal horrors of war. Number 1. The Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome, whose chastity guarded the eternal flame and the city's fate in war. In the heart of ancient Rome, for over 1,000 years, a unique group of priestesses, known as the Vestal Virgins, performed sacred duties deemed essential for the city's security and prosperity, especially during times of war. Their most defining characteristic, and an absolute unyielding requirement of their office, was their virginity, meaning they were exclusively unmarried women. This sacred chastity was not merely a personal attribute, but a cornerstone of Rome's spiritual defense. The Vestal cult dedicated to Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, home, and family, is believed to have originated as early as the Roman kingdom, possibly established by King Numa Pompilius in the 7th century before Common Era. The priestesses were chosen at a young age, typically between 6 and 10 years old, by the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. They were selected from patrician families and had to be free from physical imperfections. Once chosen, a Vestal virgin committed to 30 years of service. 10 years as a novice learning her duties, 10 years performing the sacred rites, and 10 years teaching new novices. Their primary duty was the perpetual maintenance of the sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta, located in the Roman Forum. It was believed that if this fire ever went out, it would signify a terrible omen for Rome, possibly heralding its destruction. This task required constant vigilance, day and night. Beyond tending the flame, the Vestals guarded important state documents, including wills of prominent Romans, like that of Julius Caesar and Augustus, and sacred objects, such as the Palladium, a legendary statue of Pallas Athena said to have been rescued from Troy and believed to ensure Rome's safety as long as it remained in the city. During wartime, the role of the Vestals took on heightened significance. While they did not participate in combat, their correct performance of rituals and the maintenance of their purity were considered vital for securing divine favor and ensuring Roman victory. They offered prayers and sacrifices for the state and its armies. If Rome suffered military defeats or disasters, public anxiety might turn towards the Vestals, with suspicion that some ritual impurity or a breach of vows had angered the gods. The vow of chastity was paramount. A Vestal virgin who broke this vow engaging in sexual relations was considered to have committed a grave act of pollution, endangering the entire state. Punishment was severe and terrifying. The errant Vestal was ritually buried alive in a subterranean chamber in a place called the Campus Sceleratus, or Evil Field, provided with a minimal amount of food and water, and left to die. Her male partner in the transgression would be flogged to death. Such an event was rare, but caused immense public consternation when it occurred or was suspected. Despite the strictures, Vestals held a unique and honored position in Roman society. They were the only female priests in Rome with significant public roles and were granted privileges unavailable to most other women. They were legally independent, not subject to the authority of a father or husband. They could own property, make a will, and give evidence in court. They had special seats at public games and ceremonies. When they traveled through the city, they were preceded by a lictor, an attendant who cleared the way, a right usually reserved for magistrates. Their very presence was considered sacred, and if someone condemned to death encountered a Vestal on their way to execution, they were automatically pardoned. After completing their 30 years of service, Vestals were free to leave the priesthood and marry. However, many chose to remain within the sacred precinct, having known no other life and holding a respected status. The Vestal cult endured for over 11 centuries, a constant through Rome's rise from a small city-state to a vast empire and its eventual decline. The institution was finally disbanded in 394 Common Era by the Christian Emperor Theodosius I, who extinguished the sacred fire as part of his suppression of pagan cults. For all those centuries, however, these exclusively unmarried women played a crucial, if symbolic, role in the spiritual life and perceived security of Rome, especially in its many times of war.